Are you two ready?
Yes, we are.
Fabulous. Okay. You
And
can share screens if you need to.
I'm allowed to share or?
Yes.
Okay, are y'all able to see?
Yes, we are. Thank you.
Okay, there you go. For some reason, y'all disappeared once I started sharing my screen, but here. Okay. All right. So Christy and I spent some time looking at the reviewing the charter contract as well as the charter law, and then examining and discussing recommendations for meeting the contractual as well as statutory obligations for underserved student population, and then recommendations for the contract. We started off first by identifying what underserved population is according to the contract, and then going into any challenges, and then the recommendations. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to stop us. So first, what is underserved student population? So the Mississippi Charter School Authorizer Board defines underserved student population as students who participate in the federal free lunch program, who qualify for at-risk funding under the MAEP program, and then students who are identified as having special education needs. We first talked about enrollment challenges, since the focus is on enrollment of underserved students. At risk, students who are identified as receiving free and reduced lunch. One of the challenges for first year charter schools, particularly those enrolling kindergarten students, the data is not always readily available at the start of the school year to determine if they qualify for free and reduced lunch. But of course, we know this is how students are identified as at risk. And I'll speak a little bit more into this because it did have an impact on Ambition Prep, as we did enroll kindergarten students. So at the beginning of the year, first, is anybody familiar with the process of how free and reduced lunch is? Students are identified by MDE? Okay. So they give you the option of CEP, is what they call, which is the community
Eligibility.
Provision, yes. And so that's what we chose. And when we went and put our students into MSIS, it came back that only about maybe 40 to 50% qualified for free and reduced lunch. We knew that was wrong. Something was, because they were coming from the same, all of our students pretty much came from Jackson Public Schools. But what happened was that kindergarten students, unless they attended a state preschool or a Head Start, they would not have the free and reduced lunch tag to them. They didn't have any information for them in the system. So it had to be looked at again later on. So we were able to get MDE to look at it about a month later, and then it went up to about 80%. And at that point, we had to choose that number because we needed to move forward with actually getting reimbursed for meals. However, a month later, it came back 100%. But because of that, we didn't get reimbursement for 100% at the beginning for the school year at all. We just got up to 80%. But this is how it can impact enrollment. If this had lasted longer, it may have shown that it may have gave inaccurate information, but luckily that did not happen. And then for
DRG, can I jump in and just add something, because I think it's most appropriate here. One thing before COVID that we were seeing in Midtown, particularly in the fall, and of course we've never had any issues with meeting those numbers, but one thing that we did start seeing when we were doing those direct match is a decrease in the percentage. And of course, once you sign up for CEP, then you use that percentage, but you still have to do the direct match throughout the year to show that you're doing that. And something that we were seeing was a decrease in the numbers of families that were coming through with a direct match. And I know that, of course, we know that we're serving the population we need to serve. We know that the majority of our families are not significantly better off. In terms of being able to move, out of that area, unfortunately. But we are also privy to some other information because we have a DHS office in our building. And we were hearing that families were getting off SNAP because of the SNAP requirements. And if families were not getting a significant amount of SNAP, then it was not worth their time to go through, or they didn't think that it was worth their time to go through the new hoops that DHS put into place to continue to receive SNAP. So families were just not doing that. And so before COVID hit, the DHS office was already seeing a decrease in SNAP cases, which would end up impacting JPS at some point when they went back to do their CSP application, but just not at this point. Now, of course, COVID hit and all that goes out the window. So, because now we have an abundance of families that, are receiving some type of public assistance and, will show up now on the direct match. But that is something that we were starting to see before COVID. So, just to throw that out, that, it's good as we start seeing SNAP cases decrease, but it does impact, the number of families that will qualify for free and reduced lunch without doing meal forms. So I just wanted to throw that out for everyone to know.
Thank you, Christy, for explaining that. And I do want to say we were 100% before school started this year. So having that additional grade of first grade and second grade with all of them, like you said, most of them went through the process for SNAP. We were able to be at 100% prior to the start of school. And so we received 100% reimbursement this year. But also, we went there for enrollment challenges with special populations. Currently, the Mississippi Charter School Authorized Board contract compares data of charter schools to large districts. This could have a major impact on meeting contractual numbers, particularly in the entry grades. So fifth grade, if you're starting with fifth grade, especially if you're starting with elementary, kindergarten, for smaller schools as well, if you lose 1 or 2 students, you can fall under the contract required percentage, just depending on where your enrollment is. And I think Christy said this may have happened at Midtown at one point throughout the year, and it did at Ambition Prep. We were at our percentage, and then we lost 2 twins, a family. And those 2 students caused us to go under just from losing 2 students. So it has a greater impact than larger school districts or even charter schools with larger populations. And then this is just an example here. And this is just Ambition Prep example because I wanted to use data that I actually have and got from MDE. But this is just an example of how it may affect a charter school meeting the obligations in the contract. So for instance, the approximate percentage of special education students per grade level in JPS. At kindergarten, you can see it's actually around 5% now. And then first grade is 5.3%. And then second grade, it actually dropped to 5.1%. And then, and these are approximate, and then sixth grade is around 11%. So JPS average may be at, I believe, 8 point something percent, but it's an average across K-12. And so how does this impact charter schools? If we are charter schools that start with elementary, and as we grow charter schools in Mississippi, I'm sure there'll be many more. You're looking at kindergarten and first grade. And if a student did not attend a state preschool or Head Start program, most likely they have not started the process for identification. And you do see a drop from first grade to second grade. And I'm just assuming that this is because of speech and language. It's going to actually drop a little because so many students are identified as having a speech disability early on. And then actually that decreases as they get older and learning the phonics. So. And then recommendations to meet obligations for the contract. At-risk population, we talked about Mississippi Department of Education, Child and Nutrition. First year charter schools should work closely with the Child and Nutrition Department at the start of the school year to define alternate ways to identify free and reduced lunch if needed. So maybe actually doing the applications instead of using the SNAP, which can be, has its own challenges. And then a lottery to determine at-risk students prior to the lottery date if needed. And we haven't had to do a lottery yet, but I believe, Christy, have y'all done a lottery?
We did early on. And, you know, I think we talked about this one a little bit in our last meeting at a time that we were sending, and it was required of us for 1 year to send our application, our wait list, or our list of students to the authorizer for you to find out from MDE whether they were considered at risk or they had an IEP. So, and then of course we did not do that the last couple of years because we have not had a lottery, but I guess just some clarification around that as to whether that's a requirement now from the authorizer for us to do that, or whether that's something that individual charters need to monitor and see if they are going to have enough for a lottery, that they have that information as to who would be classified at risk and who would be classified as having an IEP for preference.
Mm-hmm. Christy, my only experience with the lottery has been with Clarksdale. And they have had to have a lottery, but both of my enrollment seasons that I've been here now. And the first one, of course, I didn't know what I didn't know. I was, completely lost. Didn't even know who to reach out to. But we were able to get communication between MDE and Clarksdale, and they worked together. But we didn't collect any information. They did that information gathering, and they worked together, and OTSS provided the information to them.
Okay. Then I think, as we, I guess document for future charters, making sure that they know that.
Yeah.
That they know that that's, the option, that because we don't ask, on our application if students have IEPs, obviously, because we try to do, the
Right.
blind enrollment. And being as open as we can, but the only way for you to know is if you ask, or if you're able to find out somewhere else. So just having that somewhere for new charters so that they would know that's an option.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you for reminding us.
And we were actually able to pull it from MSIS. So when we did a search for MSIS, for students in MSIS, we were able to see who had an IEP, free and reduced lunch. And we actually found out that it was many more than what the application actually showed. And we were able to get those students' IEPs even quicker because of that.
DRG, were you able to see the MSIS, through MSIS, were you able to see the children's files without having control of them?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, we were. It's in the search module. we weren't able to see what disability, but we knew that they had a disability. And then for special education populations, so recommendations to meet obligations of the contract, one, of course, would be child find. So ensuring that recruitment efforts include special education populations. So ensuring that when we are recruiting, that we do have either on our website or advertising that we do serve special education population. We serve all students at charter schools. And then a lottery also, again, determine SPED students prior to, and we just talked about this as well, the date if needed. Next, sure what this is, okay. Next, recommendations for contract revisions. So these are just some recommendations that we came up with, and I'm gonna jump ahead a little. We tried to separate the contract versus statutory considerations, because we did notice that that was part of, I think, E maybe, or part E. So for the purpose of this presentation, we focus on recommendations and obligations and revision for the contract, not the actual law. So. And then first we have compare grade levels to grade levels, so apples to apples. For instance, the scenario that we talked about earlier with kindergarten and first grade numbers. So looking at the numbers in kindergarten and first grade, or for charter schools K-5, looking at K-5 and comparing that to the district that most likely is pre-K-12. And then two, rewording the contract to allow flexibility. And Christy, I'll let you speak on this one because you actually took it from we wanted to reference it, but reference the new contract as well.
Yeah, so this was the wording that came out of the new contract, the Exhibit E, page 38, which we talked a little bit about this last time. Just the wording says that the charter school must give enrollment preference to underserved students, but at what point does that stop? You know, because we also talked about that you could easily become a school for students with IEPs if you're always having to give preference to students with IEPs. And so one thing that we would recommend is that preference be considered until the school has met or exceeded the underserved composition that's required. So I think it's a little wording, and I think last time we talked about, like, the intention would be to make sure that, you know, you meet your contractual obligations, right, but that it would not, it's not indefinite in terms of, you know, a preference. So that was just something that we added in there for thought.
So Christy, are you talking primarily about the word preference? I mean, is that because you're going to have to continue, unless the statute would change, you'd have to continue to meet that statutory obligation of serving 80% of the percentage of whatever your demographics are in that district where you're located. So are you talking about the preference language primarily, or are you talking about, help me clarify that just a little bit.
So it's the preference language. Okay. And what is in the highlighted is, you know, just an example of maybe how it could be tweaked, just adding, you know, until the charter school meets its underserved composition. So because the way that the language states, it looks like there's a preference indefinitely, yeah, throughout the year. So as you start your wait list throughout the year, if you have children who have IEPs, they automatically would go to the top for every grade that you're serving. So, I mean, what would end up happening, which is what, you know, has happened to us, is that when you pull off your wait list, you end up pulling a student with an IEP. It could be every time you have a slot open. So it would take no time until you are heavy on students with IEPs. And I don't think that's necessarily the intent.
No, I agree. But wouldn't you just stop? Like, let's say you needed, two more children in order. You had your lottery, your wait list, whatever, and you're going to pull off that list. And you needed two more children to maybe meet that percentage or whatever. Once you got those two children enrolled, wouldn't you just go back and drop down, and then if another child wanted to enroll, pick that next child up? Is that not how?
You would, but the actual language, and this is not, I mean, this was the language from the old contract
Right.
as well, but I mean, the actual language says you must give enrollment preference. And that would be across the board, and that would be all year, because there's not additional language that says until it's met or through the first semester, or so it looks like the way that it's written that you are supposed to give preference throughout, because that other piece, that, and I know that this is really referencing to meet until you meet the underserved
Right.
student position, but that language is not here with it.
It just says to ensure,
Right.
as opposed to until.
Mhm.
Yes.
So
correct.
that's the only difference there. Avery, can you weigh in on that just a little bit? Would that be up to interpretation, or can you just weigh in a little on that for us?
As to whether the language as it exists now,
Mm-hmm.
it does seem to be a little bit up to interpretation. We could solve the question with an attorney general's opinion
Okay.
to assist with what the language actually means as it's written now. If y'all, don't want to or feel like it might be too difficult to try to have a legislation change. But we could certainly seek for an opinion request on that to get clarification as to the intent or of what the language means.
That might be a helpful first step. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think so. Just to have something to cover us, an interpretation. I mean, I think that would be fine. So just something to cover us, because I think we know the intent.
Yeah.
But that would be something to cover us.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If you guys feel like that's something that we want to move forward with, Avery and I can work on that.
Thank you.
Can I ask just a clarifying question, just to make sure that I'm understanding this, so
No.
that I'm in compliance? So like my grade 6 right now, I'm like basically at capacity, right? So let's say that tomorrow, 79 students fill out my application that they want to come to my school.
Mm-hmm.
And then number 80 applies, and the person who applies at spot 80, we somehow discover that they have an IEP. I don't know how. I guess that's one question I have, because we don't ask that on the application. But like, let's say we see an MSIS or something that number 80 has an IEP. Is this debate right now focused on, okay, let's say one of my current 6th graders leaves and now I'm going to take a new student? Is the question, I have to skip number 1, 2, 3 all the way down to number 80, and I have to pull number 80 because it could potentially be interpreted as always giving preference to underserved students?
I don't think so. My interpretation has always been, this is a collective number. It's not by grade. So the way the enrollment table is, or, looks, it just says like JPS has 10%, your obligation is 8% or whatever. So mine has always been a collective percentage, not by grade level, which is one of the recommendations here at the top, is to go in the lower grades, look at by grade level as opposed to collectively. But does that answer your question, Kevin?
Not exactly, but let's say,
Well,
So Kevin, I think I know what you're asking. Kevin, if we were below where we needed to be, then yes, that child that's 80th would go to the top.
Yeah.
But because we're not, what we're hearing is that's not the intent, is that the 80th child automatically goes to the top, because we are serving the students who we are supposed to be serving with IEPs.
but that's during the enrollment period also. So now wouldn't be, in particular, at that time.
The other tricky part of this is something that DeArchie, you mentioned a bit ago, and that is the community eligibility piece. Because the way that that kind of masks what you really have in terms of free and reduced. If you put 100% free and reduced because you have CEP, then every time we come out, or free lunch, not free and reduced, but when we would come out to do a monitoring visit or a site visit, then it's always going to look like you have 100% free. In reality, you could have, 75% free. You know what I'm saying? So we don't actually get to compare the actual to the actual, because that CEP masks that underserved population. Does that make sense? What I'm saying? Christy, you look puzzled. Am I?
And that's what the thing is. That's what JPS do too. Since we're in JPS school district, that's the way.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. It makes it tricky then for everybody if you use that 100% CEP. And we had made a note on that for framework discussion and contract discussion later on, because you can't really hold a school accountable, or you guys can't really and truly know what your free lunch or underserved is if you're using 100%. It just blankets that when you use CEP, because you don't get the actual.
Well, yeah.
So, yeah, and I don't know the answer to that. That's just another particular challenge that comes up in looking at this underserved population. I don't know that there's an easy answer for that either. So, because a lot of school districts use CEP and take advantage of it. So,
to get the 100%, I believe you have to be at, and Lisa, you may know, 77% to get that 100. So if you're anything up, like it's below a certain amount.
It is as a percentage, and I don't remember what that percentage is, but it is a percentage, and you have to be eligible at that level to get the CEP. Wow. So, or you have to meet
it's the multiplier, and I can't remember right off what that multiplier is. So if you end up with, if you do your direct match and you have 60%, then it's a 1 point something multiplier, which actually takes the number up.
Yeah. It's just another little tricky piece in here in this work and then around this conversation. Go ahead. Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And then 3, we have consideration, looking at numbers more than once a year and averaging. And this is something that the Charter School Authorized Board do. They look at the numbers more than once a year, because I believe we looked at ours in maybe December, then again in March and April maybe, or somewhere around there, but maybe even considering an average of that, because we know that students are going to leave and go to other schools and some come back, but that can have a great impact, especially if you have like a family situation where there's 2 or 3 students in the same family leaving due to relocation.
And that, to me, DRT wouldn't be necessarily a contract or a revision it's certainly not a legal revision here, but so it wouldn't reflect on either of those, but more so the performance framework and the site visit. So that would be more tied to that, because you would want to, in your guidance for the framework, when you come out to look at that enrollment, you would want to write that in as one of your metrics that you use for the performance framework piece.
Okay,
that makes sense. And I mentioned this one particularly because we, towards the end of the year, towards the end of March, the first part of March, we had, we were right at that number we were supposed to be at, and we had 2 students who have been with us since the very beginning went into Child Protective Services. And they were going to have to move to a new home. And when you use 2, with the small number that we have, that was going to drop us below where we needed to be. And, typically March, April, we're not bringing on, even if COVID had not hit, we're not enrolling new families, in that last quarter. So
right.
You have, 2 drop out right at the end. You could be in compliance all year long. And then just, something happens like that and it drops you out. So I guess that's the question, Lisa, and I'm glad to see that could just be a framework is, at what point do you all consider us being below where we're supposed to be? Is it at any point you do a review, or?
It has been, because that's the only touch point that we've had. So it has been that way. But going forward, as we work towards the framework revisions moving forward, I think this is something that we can consider, writing into that language of the framework, number one, and then in particular around the guidance, because up until last September, we didn't even have any guidance. That we got that guidance like September the 9th for an annual, performance review that was due September 30th. So it's not fleshed out like it needs to be. And I think those are internal things that can happen. That doesn't take legislation, that doesn't take board approval, that doesn't really take. Now, technically at the end of the day, when we have the framework revised totally, it would have overall board approval, but that individual work could happen without that. Correct, Avery?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
And then,
So I think these are great. I mean, things that we need to consider. And looking at the numbers more than once is certainly something that we would want to consider, because with your numbers typically being low and not thousands of children, one or two does make a difference. And so I think that any way we can work that in so that you're not penalized if you have a child that leaves is the right thing to do. So.
And it's important to note, y'all, in the statute that actually, not the definition statute, which is 3728.5, but 3728.23, which discusses this in paragraph 5, there's language in there that says that if it's less than the 80% of the enrollment of all ages in the school district, despite the school's best effort, the authorizer must consider the applicant or charter school's recruitment efforts and the understood composition of the applicant pool in determining whether they're operating in a non-discriminatory manner, which gives the board the authority to understand that that was a last-minute dropout. That gives wiggle room right there in the statute, so that, if that one of these situations you're describing happens, then that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be, in trouble, and that you're operating in a discriminatory way.
That's right. And it has happened on 2 occasions already, since we've been here. And so we have had to address this, and we have had to request information on recruiting, and that's in fact why we have the task force. That it was in response to those questions that came up through the site visit reports and looking at data and so forth. So that is why we're having the task force, to address those so that we can keep in compliance. But going back to what you were saying, Christy, about the spirit and intent of the law as well. So finding that right balance is important.
thank you for bringing that up too, Avery.
Sure.
And then 4, we have inclusion of wording for a waiver to cover any of the above. So that can be submitted by a certain date. The waiver could be the responsibility of the charter operator to submit by a certain deadline. And then 5, we have, and this is what we were just speaking about, in relation to what we were just speaking about, revising how the numbers may impact reports. So our charter annual reports or performance framework. The contract reference providing documentation of effort to meet those numbers if they weren't met. However, I'm not sure, because we haven't been in this situation yet, but from my understanding, it would still have an impact on the scoring, or however it's done, of the actual framework in the report, even if documentation is shown on that effort.
Well, the data does have to be reported accurately, regardless if there's been effort made, but there can always be an attachment or a reference to so supporting documentation could support that report. So.
Yes, thank you. And talk about this and questions. That is all.
Thank you. D. Archie, I have a question. When you all first started and you were applying for the CEP through MDE, and each month your numbers increased, was there anything that they required in addition to you all's initial application to assist with that process?
Anything that they required in addition to the application? No, they didn't. Just that we had went in MSIS and we had the SNAP, and we had actually did the application for CEP. And once you do that, you can't ask for the form. So it's one or the other.
Okay. Okay.
And I really don't think it was anything that we could have done with kindergarten at that point, besides forfeited the reimbursement rates for a month until we had the actual solid numbers. But it was worked out this year, and it didn't have a great impact. So,
Okay.
due to us not serving lunch during the time of COVID, so it didn't have a huge impact on the losses either. So.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Dr. Lisa and Dr. Vanda, I'm wondering, and I don't know what other states are doing, but is there any move, even at a national level, is free and reduced lunch still considered the best standard for determining at-risk status?
You know, Kevin, that's a great question. And it has been historically that. At one point there was some conversation about using census data, I think. I want to say that was a part of the conversation. I don't know how they figure it using that, to be honest with you, but I think in my experience as federal programs, that is all we ever used was free and reduced lunch.
Yeah, it seems industry standard.
Yeah, yeah.
I was unaware. I'm glad that DRG spoke up because I was unaware of a lot of the challenges in that reporting. And so it just made me think about what that could mean. So
yeah. It used to, I don't know that CEP made it a little bit more difficult than traditionally. You had the old form that was this long that every parent had to fill out, and then it went to child nutrition, and then they determined, and they had to meet this range in terms of their annual income and how many kids were in the family. And so child nutrition handled all of that, and they had to turn in their forms, and that's how that was done. But it seems like with CEP it might mask some of the realities. And I don't know that there's an easy perfect way to figure underserved. I don't know.
Well,
And I think that's exactly what was going to happen, as I was talking about families moving off of public assistance.
Mm-hmm.
That's, exactly, I think, what we would have seen when JPS got ready to do their CEP again. So, and, because you only do it every 5 years, you're going to keep the same, when you're an established district, you're going to keep that same amount. But I think and I've been mentioning to my team, that we needed to be aware of that, because that's just something that we've been seeing at the DHS office.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've also been talking, to DHS about, in terms of it's great to show numbers of families getting off of SNAP, but the reality is that we know that our families are still very much in need. Mm-hmm. And so, showing as a state that we have less families on SNAP is great, but that is ultimately going to impact federal funding, to another agency like MDE. Right. Down to the school. So, I'd started that conversation with them, and then, like I said, COVID hit, and that all went out the window, and now it's, probably sky high in terms of
yeah.
So,
yeah.
And just
good question, though, Kevin.
Okay, thank you. And also just to say, I know we've talked a few times about like, gosh, when you're a small school and a few students move away, like it can really turn your numbers down. I would say the opposite is also true, right? So like my 5th grade numbers are crazy high, and it looks, it looks like we are very high numbers, but to be honest, like I can't take too much credit for that, because it's literally just a few kids. Like it's just, it can go as much as it can go down, like it can also go up. And like, that's just the nature of being a small school, is like, you shift wildly. And then also, I know we're like mainly talking about enrollment here, but I think it also has implications for the SPED budget, because, you know, it's like this, my understanding is like the budget that we've received this year is based on the SPED population that we have last year.
Mm-hmm.
But like that could be very, like that, it can
Oh,
just
yeah.
take
Yeah.
so much
Yeah.
just when you have a few number of kids in either direction. So sometimes
right.
it doesn't look very good, and sometimes it looks very good, but it's
And
just,
traditional schools fight that same battle because
Yeah.
they're funded the same way, right? So their FTEs come in based on the
right.
population
But with
from
the law,
last
with the
year.
law of large numbers, it
Mhm.
like I think it tends to affect smaller schools
Yeah.
a little bit differently. Yeah. And I want to thank Dr. Hendricks and DRG for presenting. I also want to really thank Avery, because not to like repeat or underscore that point, but like when what you just spoke like was hugely illuminating for me. Because you know, it's sometimes, you know, when we received a letter that was like, hey, you're a little bit like, watch
Yeah.
where your numbers are at, like I kind of felt like, well, what can I do right now? Like, unless I just pick a random kid and like, I'm gonna test you, you know, like it's like, what do I do? The numbers are the numbers. And I appreciate Avery's point, which is like the numbers are important, but like also the spirit of it is we want to make sure you're not keeping kids out who like you should be serving.
That's
And
right.
like we are all the time trying to tell everybody like, you know, the services we provide and the things that we do and all this other stuff. And it's like
Yeah.
sometimes it's just the numbers are just the numbers. And so I really appreciate Avery you clarifying that point, that it's like as long as the school is showing and I mean I can show you, we've bought Facebook ads that say, you know, like we've done all these different things. We've gone to elementary schools, all that stuff, you know, as long as the school is able to show,
Right.
you're not keeping kids out. And in fact, you're like trying to like increase your population. It's just at the end of the day, the numbers are the numbers are the numbers.
Right. And you're not violating an OCR. We're not getting a complaint. You know, that's where it really gets.
Yeah, like you're not going to get anybody telling you that they tried to come to Midtown and they were told no because they had a special. Yeah, you're not going to get anybody like that.
Right. Thanks, Kevin. Yes, and thank you, Dr. Hendricks and Mr. Scott as well. A really great presentation, and I really appreciate you all taking out the time invested in presenting that information to us. It definitely allows me to see what you all see as it relates to recruitment of your underserved population. So I greatly appreciate it. Next steps coming up is for Dr. Hendricks and Mr. Scott, of course, to go ahead and upload you all's presentation into our shared Google folder so that our members who were not here, or even those of us that have been throughout this meeting, can go back and reference your presentation for sure. So just go ahead and upload that for us. Another goal for our very next meeting is for our next group of presenters with their charge for the very next meeting, which will take place on September the 8th. So charge F, E, and F. Dr. K, D. Archie, and Mr. Billingsley will present during our next meeting on September the 8th. So we look forward to that. Does anyone have any questions at this time?
No, I just want to say thanks to both of you for your hard work on that. That was a great presentation. It has good information. It has a lot of good references that we can circle back to when we continue our conversation around framework and accountability, and so that we can make sure we meet, again, the spirit and intent of the law and make sure everybody stays in compliance, but understanding, you know, where we are and that we live in a little bit of a different world than the traditional schools do. So thanks for your hard work on that.
Thank you all for listening. Really do appreciate it. And Christy, I enjoyed working with you on this.
And I appreciate everyone's flexibility, you know, in pushing the meeting to this week. It's a little crazy. So I have one that's touring colleges trying to get in, and one that we're moving to Oxford today. So leaving right after this, headed to Oxford. So hopefully back in the office Thursday, business as usual. But thank you for your flexibility.
Yeah. All right. Well, you guys have a great afternoon. Safe travels, Christy. And y'all let us know if we can do anything to help you.
Thank you.